At our family barbecue in my backyard, my son, an FBI agent, suddenly snatched the wine from my hand before I could drink it. Dad, don't touch anything else. I thought his job was making him paranoid, but his face was deadly serious. He wrapped the glass in a napkin, scanned the table, and asked, "Who gave this to you?" Then my phone rang. He saw the screen and went pale. Don't answer it. That hit differently, didn't it? If it did, like this video and tell me where you're watching from. Drop your city, your country right below. You're part of something here at Dad's Family Stories, and I don't want you to miss how this ends. Fair warning, some story details are fictional, included for entertainment and educational purposes. Resemblance to any names or locations is coincidental, but what this story means, that part is yours to keep. I have lived in this house for 31 years, and I know every sound it makes. The way the back porch creaks near the left railing. The way the kitchen door sticks in humid weather. The way the wind off the Chesapeake comes through the yard in September and makes the oak tree sound like it's breathing. I know all of it. After Margaret died, that knowledge became a kind of company. So when I tell you that something felt wrong that Sunday afternoon, before my son even touched my arm, I need you to understand. I am not a man who imagines things. It was the last Sunday of September 2025. I had set up the backyard the way Margaret always did for family gatherings, the old wooden picnic table near the oak, the folding chairs in a loose semicircle, the charcoal grill I have refused to replace, even though Nathan has offered 3 times to buy me something newer. The sky was that particular shade of pale blue that only shows up in Maryland in the fall when summer finally stops fighting. I had sold the house. Not this one, the first one. The house on Fieldcrest Drive where Margaret and I raised our children, where she planted the rose bushes along the back fence where Nathan broke his collarbone falling out of that same oak tree at age 9. 30 years of living pressed into a 3-bedroom colonial, and in August I had handed the keys to a young couple who looked at the rose bushes the way people look at things they plan to remove. I received $180,000. I had been sitting with that number for 6 weeks, turning it over in my mind, the way you turn over something fragile, carefully, not sure where to set it down. The gathering was small. That was my choice. Nathan drove up from Baltimore with Diane, his wife of 19 years. My daughter Rachel came with her husband Derek, who worked in financial consulting and had the kind of easy confidence that I had always associated with men who were very good at their jobs or very good at pretending to be. Margaret had liked Derek well enough. She had never said she didn't trust him. She had also never said she did. "Dad, you want something to drink?" Rachel called from the table where she was arranging the paper plates the way her mother used to, overlapping slightly, like fish scales. "In a minute," I said. I was standing at the grill adjusting coals that didn't need adjusting. It gave me something to do with my hands. Derek appeared at my elbow with a glass of red wine. He moved quietly for a large man, something I had noticed before, but never quite registered as unusual. "Cabernet," he said, extending the glass with a smile that reached all the way to his eyes. That was the thing Derek was good at. Smiles that looked complete. "You've earned it, Walter. Big sale, new chapter." "Thank you, son," I said, and I took the glass. I liked Derek well enough in that moment. I want to be honest about that. I was raising the wine to my lips. The glass was cool, the wine was dark. The afternoon smelled like charcoal and cut grass when Nathan's hand closed around my wrist. Not gently. "Dad." His voice was flat in a way I recognized from his work calls. "Who gave you that?" My chest tightened. "Derek, what's the matter with you?" Nathan took the glass from my hand, not snatching, but firmly wrapping a paper napkin around the stem before he touched it. He looked down at the small square cocktail napkin that had been tucked beneath the glass. It was white with a small logo printed in navy blue, a stylized lighthouse above 2 words. Harbor Crest Financial. Nathan's jaw tightened. One quick, controlled clench the way he looks when he is deciding something fast. Derek. He turned, holding the glass at his side napkin still wrapped around it. Where'd you get this coaster? Derek glanced at the napkin and let out a short, easy laugh. Grabbed a stack from a client meeting last week. Must have thrown a few in my jacket pocket. Did I commit a crime? Nathan. He spread his hands, still smiling. It's a paper napkin. Of course it is, Diane said immediately, stepping closer to Derek. Her voice was warm and slightly amused, the tone she used when she thought Nathan was being difficult. Nathan, don't make a scene at your father's party. He just sold his house. Let him enjoy his wine. But Nathan was not looking at Diane. He was looking at Derek the way a man looks at something he is memorizing. Harbor Crest ring any bells for you? Nathan asked. His voice was almost conversational. Derek tilted his head. Should it? Nathan held his gaze for exactly 2 seconds. Then he folded the napkin carefully around the glass, tucked it under his arm, and said, I'll get you a fresh drink, Dad, and walked toward the house. My heart was knocking against my ribs, and I did not fully understand why. Rachel had moved closer, her paper plates forgotten, watching her brother's back as he disappeared through the screen door. Derek turned to me with an expression of patient, slightly wounded bewilderment. I'm sorry about that, he said. Nathan's job gets inside his head sometimes. You know how it is. I do, I said, but my eyes had gone to Diane. She was already talking to Rachel, her hand on my daughter's arm, laughing at something. She had moved away from Derek the moment Nathan left, quickly, smoothly, too quickly. I stood at my grill and looked at the yard full of people who shared my name and my history, and I felt something shift beneath the afternoon like a floorboard, giving way underfoot, quiet and certain and impossible to unfeel. The sun was still warm. The oak tree was still breathing. In my pocket, my phone began to vibrate. I stepped away from the grill and pulled out my phone. The number on the screen meant nothing to me. No name, no area code. I recognized just 10 digits staring back. Somewhere behind me, I could hear Derek telling Rachel a story about a fishing trip, his voice carrying that particular rhythm of a man who is very comfortable being listened to. I answered, Mr. Harrison. The voice was professional, measured, the kind of voice that belongs to people who sit in quiet offices with good lighting. This is First Capital Bank Security calling on behalf of your personal accounts. Sir, I need to inform you that we've detected an unusual transaction flagged on the account holding your recent deposit of $180,000. We need to verify your identity immediately to prevent any unauthorized access. My stomach dropped. $180,000. The exact number. The exact bank. We've sent a 6-digit confirmation code to your registered phone number. The voice continued. Once you read that code to me, we can lock the account and reverse any suspicious activity. This will only take 60 seconds, Mr. Harrison. Can you read me that code? My phone buzzed against my ear, a text arriving. I pulled it away from my face and saw the message, a 6-digit number, from what appeared to be First Capital's automated system. Derek materialized at my left shoulder so smoothly I did not hear him coming. Everything okay, Walter? His hand landed on my arm, warm and steady. Bank trouble. Here, let me help you. These security calls can be confusing. Just read me the code and I'll walk you through it. Something cold moved through my chest. Not fear exactly. something older and quieter than fear. Nathan crossed the yard in 6 strides and stepped between Derek and me. He plucked the phone from my hand before I could protest, pressed it to his own ear for exactly 3 seconds, and ended the call. "Nathan," I started, "that caller knew you were hosting a backyard cookout today." Nathan's voice was low-controlled, each word placed carefully. "Your bank does not know that. First Capital's fraud department does not call customers to ask for confirmation codes. That is a standard social engineering scam, which means someone coached that caller with specific details about you." He held up my phone screen, facing me. "How many people knew today's gathering was happening, Dad? And how many of those people knew exactly how much money is sitting in that account?" The blood in my ears was very loud. Derek let out a breath that landed somewhere between a laugh and a sigh. "Nathan." He spread both hands, his expression shifting into something patient and slightly pained. "You grabbed a drink out of your father's hand because of a paper napkin. Now you're cutting off a call from his bank because what you think I coached a phone scammer to attack a family BBQ?" He shook his head. "This is what you do. You turn every room into a crime scene." Diane moved to Derek's side and touched his elbow. "He doesn't mean it personally," she said, and her voice was the same warm, reasonable tone she always used when she was smoothing something over. She looked at me with eyes full of gentle concern. "Are you all right, Walter? Can I get you some water?" My throat tightened. I wanted to say something, but I couldn't find the right words, so I said nothing and hated myself for it. That evening, after the others had driven away and the yard was quiet, Nathan called me from his car. He was still in the neighborhood. He had not gone home yet. "The wine came back clean," he said without greeting. "I had it tested. No substances." I exhaled so hard my shoulders ached. "Well, that's something. Don't thank Derek for that." Nathan's voice had an edge I rarely heard from him. Not anger exactly, but something close to it. Something pressed thin. "The drink wasn't about poisoning you, Dad. Think about where he was standing when that call came in. Right at your shoulder. Close enough to read your screen. Close enough to hear the code if you'd read it out loud." A pause. "The glass was a reason to stand next to you. The call was the actual weapon." I sat down on the porch steps, phone pressed hard against my ear. The oak tree was dark against the sky. The yard smelled like cooling charcoal and the end of summer. "Nathan," I said carefully. "The caller knew the exact amount. $180,000. I know. I never told Derek that number." The line was quiet for a moment, and in that quiet I felt something that had been loose and uncertain inside me all afternoon begin to solidify into something much harder. "No," Nathan said. "You didn't." After we hung up, I sat on those steps for a long time. The neighborhood sounds settled around me, a neighbor's dog, a car passing on the main road, the distant percussion of someone else's television through an open window. Normal sounds. Ordinary evening sounds. I thought about Diane moving away from Derek the moment Nathan walked toward the house. I thought about how quickly she had said it's just a paper napkin. I thought about every Tuesday afternoon for the past 14 months, sitting in my kitchen with a casserole dish between us, while she asked me questions that had seemed at the time like nothing more than kindness. I pressed my palm flat against the wooden step beside me. Margaret had painted these steps herself 12 years ago, a color she called harbor blue. The paint was worn now at the edges, but still held in the center where people stepped. I went inside, walked to the study, and stood in front of the right-hand drawer of my desk, the small scratch at the lower corner. The mark Margaret had left when she caught the drawer with her ring one afternoon. The mark I had never fixed, because I couldn't bring myself to sand away something she'd touched, was still there. But the drawer itself was not sitting flush the way I left it every morning. Someone had opened it. The scratch was still there. I crouched in front of my desk drawer and pressed my fingertip against the small gouge in the lower corner of the wood, the mark Margaret left years ago when her wedding ring caught the edge mid-pull. She had been mortified. I had told her it gave the desk character. She had rolled her eyes and kissed my cheek, and the conversation had moved on the way conversations do when two people have been together long enough that small accidents feel like gifts rather than damages. I had never fixed it. I never would. But the drawer itself was wrong. I could feel it without measuring a gap of perhaps a quarter-inch on the right side, where the wood should have sat flush against the frame. I open that drawer every single morning to retrieve my reading glasses, and I close it with the same automatic care a man develops over 30 years of the same routine. It had not been left like this by me. I pulled it open fully. The papers were there. The copy of the closing documents from the Fieldcrest Drive sale, the folder with my account information. The handwritten notes I had made about potential investment options. Everything present. Everything exactly where it should be. Except the order was wrong. I keep the closing documents on top because I had been reviewing them most recently. Now the account folder sat on top, slightly askew, as though it had been lifted and replaced by someone who was careful, but not careful enough. My hands trembled as I touched the edge of that folder, a fine, involuntary shaking that started in my fingers and worked its way up to my elbows before I could steady myself against the desk. "Who were you?" I said to the empty room. My voice came out rougher than I intended. "While my son was outside arguing with your husband, where exactly were you?" Diane had asked to use the bathroom during the commotion. I remembered that now with a clarity that made my stomach clench so hard I had to sit down in my desk chair. She had touched my arm first, so warm, so concerned, and said, "Walter, let me get you some water." And then she had gone inside, and I had been so focused on Nathan and Derek that I had never once looked at the clock. 15 minutes. She had been inside for at least 15 minutes. I picked up my phone and typed a message to Nathan. "Can you come by tomorrow morning? Something I want to show you." I kept it short. I had learned from 40 years of watching my son that specific words in writing have a way of becoming evidence, and I was not yet sure what I was holding evidence of. His reply came in under a minute, already planned on it. "Don't touch the drawer." I stared at those 4 words. Don't touch the drawer. He had known before I told him. Or he had guessed, which with Nathan amounted to the same thing. I set the phone on the desk and pressed both palms flat against the wood surface, Margaret's wood. Her desk, that I had inherited along with her reading chair and her habit of keeping fresh flowers near the kitchen window. The trembling in my hands had moved into my chest, now settling somewhere behind my sternum as a tight, persistent ache that had nothing to do with my heart and everything to do with it. 41 years, I told the desk. That's how long I've been in this family. And I missed it. I did not sleep well. The house made its usual sounds, the porch creak, the kitchen door settling, the oak tree breathing. But each sound arrived with a question mark attached that it had never carried before. At 2 a.m, I got up and made chamomile tea and sat at the kitchen table in the dark. Not because I wanted tea, but because sitting in the dark with something warm in my hands is what Margaret used to do when something troubled her. And after 15 months alone, I had started borrowing her habits the way a person borrows a coat. My phone lit up at 6:47 with a call from Rachel. "Dad." Her voice was steady, but I had raised that girl. and I could hear the thing underneath the steadiness. "Are you alone right now?" "Yes," I said. "Are you coming over?" "I'm already in the driveway." I was at the front door before she reached the porch steps. She looked like she had not slept either. There were shadows under her eyes, and her hair was pulled back in the quick, careless way she does when she does not have patience for the mirror. But her chin was set, and her eyes were clear, and I recognized the expression on her face because I had seen it on her mother's face 100 times, a woman who has made a decision and is ready to speak it. "Come in," I said. "I'll put coffee on in a minute." She stepped inside and touched my arm briefly, just a press of her fingers the way she used to when she was small, and wanted to make sure I was real. "I need to tell you something first, and I need you to just listen without interrupting. Can you do that, Dad?" My throat tightened. "Of course I can." She pulled off her jacket and hung it on the hook by the door, Margaret's hook, the brass one shaped like a crescent moon, and said, "I've been watching them for almost a year." The ache behind my sternum sharpened into something with edges. "Sit down, sweetheart," I said. "Start from the beginning." Rachel wrapped both hands around her coffee mug, the way a person holds something they need to keep from floating away, and she started talking. "It was Thanksgiving last year," she said. "We were all at the table, you, me, Derek, Nathan, Diane. You were telling that story about the time you and Mom got lost driving back from the Outer Banks. Everyone was laughing." She paused. Diane twisted her ring. I watched my daughter's face. Twisted it how Rachel set her mug down and demonstrated taking her own ring and rotating it inward so the stone faced her palm, hidden against the skin of her hand. Like that, just a small movement. And 30 seconds later, Derek said he needed to check something on his phone and excused himself from the table. People check their phones. I said, though, even as the words left my mouth, I could feel how thin they sounded. They do," Rachel said. So I told myself it was nothing. But then it happened again at Christmas. Diane reached for the serving spoon for the mashed potatoes, and while her hand was up near the dish, she turned the ring same way, stone inward, and Derek said he'd left something in the car and got up. Her voice tightened. "He was gone for 8 minutes, Dad." I counted. And when he came back, he sat down, and the conversation just kept moving, and nobody said anything, because why would they? My coffee had gone cold in my cup. I didn't notice until I tried to swallow. "How many times?" I asked. Rachel pressed her lips together, and I watched the muscles in her jaw work the way they did when she was holding something painful in place with sheer will. 6 times that I wrote down. There may have been more before I started keeping track. She reached into the pocket of her jacket and produced a folded piece of paper, actual paper, handwritten, the kind of record a person keeps when they don't want anything saved to a phone. She slid it across the table to me. I unfolded it. 6 entries. Date, location, which ring movement. How long Derek was gone, what excuse he used each time. Rachel's handwriting was small and precise, the same handwriting she'd had since elementary school. My chest cracked open a little looking at that paper. My daughter had been carrying this alone for almost a year, tracking her own husband's behavior in a notebook, like a woman collecting evidence against herself. The pain of that, the loneliness of it, the quiet courage of it hit me somewhere deep and physical, like a door slamming shut in my ribcage. "Rachel." My voice came out rough. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" Her eyes went bright and wet at the corners, but she blinked hard and kept them from spilling over. "Because I thought I might be wrong, Dad. Because thinking your husband is signaling your sister-in-law across a dinner table is not something a person wants to believe about their own life." She pulled the paper back toward her and folded it along the same creases. And because every time I almost said something, I talked myself out of it. I kept thinking, if I'm wrong, I've blown up my marriage over a ring movement and an overactive imagination. And now? I asked. She looked at me steadily. Now I think I wasn't wrong. The front door opened. We both turned as Nathan came through, still wearing his coat, moving with the quick, purposeful stride that told me he had been up as long as we had. He stopped in the kitchen doorway, read our faces in about 2 seconds, and pulled out the chair between us without asking permission. "You started without me," he said, but he was not complaining. "Rachel has something to tell you," I said. Nathan looked at his sister. Rachel picked up the folded paper and put it flat on the table between them without a word. Nathan studied her face first. He always reads people before he reads documents, and something crossed his expression that I could not fully name. Not surprise. Something quieter and harder than surprise. He unfolded the paper and read it through once. His jaw tightened on the third entry. On the fifth, he turned the page slightly toward the light from the window, as though to make sure he was reading it correctly. When he finished, he set it down and pressed his palm over it, flat, the way you press a hand over something you don't want to move in a wind. 6 confirmed times, he said. "At least," Rachel said. "Did you ever test it? Initiate a conversation with Derek right after you saw the signal. See if he found a reason to leave." Rachel's chin lifted a fraction of an inch. "February. I asked him directly about a financial decision we needed to make, something he would normally want to weigh in on right away. Diane turned her ring while he was mid-sentence. He stopped talking, said he'd forgotten to forward an email, and left the room for 12 minutes. A tear broke loose from her left eye, despite everything she was doing to prevent it, and she wiped it with the back of her hand in one fast, almost angry motion. I sat there making conversation with Diane for 12 minutes, Dad. I looked right at her and talked about the weather and what we were doing for spring break, and I thought, God, she is so good at this. She is so incredibly good at looking like nothing is happening." Nathan had been watching his sister with an expression that made my throat ache. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "You're not wrong," he said quietly. "And you're not crazy. And this is not your fault." Rachel made a sound that was almost a laugh and almost wasn't. "I know it's not my fault. It's just—" She pressed her free hand against her sternum as though her ribs hurt. "It's just that I loved him, Nathan. I actually loved him. And I keep sitting here trying to figure out exactly which version of that was real." The three of us stayed around that kitchen table for a long moment, the coffee going cold, the morning light coming through the window at a low September angle that made everything look slightly golden and slightly sad at the same time. Then Nathan reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his phone. He set it on the table face up. "There's something I need to show you both," he said. "Before we go any further with what Rachel found, I need you to understand what I've been sitting on since last night." He looked at me first, then at Rachel. "I have messages. And when you see them, the ring makes sense, but it's going to make it worse, not better." Rachel pressed her palm flat against the table beside her mug, steadying herself. I watched my daughter take a breath the way a person takes a breath before walking into cold water. "Show us," she said. Nathan placed his phone flat on the table between us and slid it toward Rachel first. "Diane sent me these last night," he said. "Right after she got home from the cookout. Read them the way she wanted me to read them, top to bottom, nothing else." Rachel picked up the phone. Her eyes moved across the screen quickly at first, then slower, the way eyes slow down when they are reading something that does not make immediate sense. I watched the color drain from her face in a gradual, terrible way, like water leaving a basin. "These are my messages," she said. "To Dad." "Keep reading," Nathan said. Rachel set the phone on the table and pushed it toward me without a word, pressing her lips together so hard they went white at the edges. I picked it up and read. The messages were between Rachel and me, a thread from 3 months ago. In the version Diane had forwarded to Nathan, Rachel appeared to ask me pointed questions about the sale, which bank held the proceeds, whether I had signed any new paperwork, what the account number was, whether I had considered moving the money somewhere with better returns. Read in isolation, without context, they painted a picture of a daughter probing her elderly father's finances with uncomfortable specificity. "She cut the top off," Rachel said, and her voice had dropped to something low and tightly controlled that I recognized as the tone she used when she was most furious. "Nathan, scroll up. The whole conversation starts 3 messages before what she sent you." Nathan took the phone back, scrolled, and his expression shifted, a small tightening around the eyes that told me he was recalibrating something he had half believed overnight. "Read it out loud," I said. "Please." Nathan cleared his throat. Rachel's first message, the one Diane cut, says, "Dad, I'm worried. Derek mentioned something to a colleague about private investment funds for retirees with liquid assets. I don't want to alarm you, but can you tell me exactly where the house money is sitting right now? I want to make sure nobody's approached you about moving it." He set the phone down. The next message is you confirming First Capital and the account details. Then Rachel asking follow-up questions about whether anyone had suggested alternatives. He looked at his sister. "She was warning you, Dad." Diane cut everything that showed why Rachel was asking. Rachel's hands were shaking now, a fine, rapid trembling she was trying to control by pressing them flat on the table. "I sent those messages because I was scared for him. I told you, Nathan. I tried to tell you 3 weeks ago something felt off about Derek's interest in Dad's accounts, and you said I was being... I know what I said." Nathan's voice was rough with something that was not quite guilt, but was close enough to it that I felt it from across the table. "I told you Derek was just being thorough, that it was his job to notice these things." He rubbed a hand hard across his jaw. "I was wrong." Rachel made a sound that cracked at the edges. "She sent you a version of my messages that made me look like I was targeting our father's money, and you almost believed it." "Rachel, no, say it. You almost believed it." Nathan looked at his sister steadily. "For about 4 hours last night, yes. I almost believed it." The honesty of that landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Rachel's eyes filled not the controlled, blinked-back moisture from earlier, but a real flooding that she couldn't stop this time. 2 tears ran straight down her cheeks, and she let them go, pressing both palms harder against the table as though the pressure could substitute for steadiness. 4 hours, she said. "Nathan, I have been trying to protect this family. I know." He reached across and gripped her forearm, not gently, firmly, the way you hold on to someone in a current. "I know that now, and I am sorry." I had been watching my 2 children from across that table, and I felt something in my chest that was equal parts heartbreak and pride, heartbreak at what Diane had attempted, pride at watching Rachel hold herself upright through it. I reached out and covered Rachel's hand with mine. "She knew exactly what she was doing," I said. "Sending those messages at night when emotions are high and verification is harder. She wanted Nathan to doubt you before morning gave him time to check." Rachel wiped her face with the back of her wrist, a single decisive motion. "It almost worked." Almost," Nathan said. He picked up the phone again and looked at it the way he looks at things he is deciding what to do with. "The question now is how she knew what was in those messages." Rachel sent them to you, Dad, on your personal phone. Diane shouldn't have had access to your text thread with Rachel. The three of us held that question for a moment. Then Nathan looked at me directly, and something in his expression shifted into the particular quality of careful that I associated with the moments in his work when he was about to ask something he already partially knew the answer to. He said quietly, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Not protective of anyone, not trying to explain it away. He set the phone down and folded his hands. What did you tell Diane about your finances, about the accounts, the sale, the money, all of it? Everything you can remember. My stomach turned over slowly, like something heavy finding its way to the bottom, because the answer was not a short one, and it was not a comfortable one, and it was entirely, completely my fault. I have spent a great deal of my life being a careful man. I checked the oil in my car every 3,000 miles before they told us that was no longer necessary. I kept a paper copy of every important document I ever signed, because Margaret said the cloud was fine right up until it wasn't. I taught my children to look both ways twice before crossing. Careful, measured, deliberate. And then my wife died, and a woman started coming to my house every Tuesday with a casserole dish and a warm smile, and I handed her everything she needed to rob me blind. Start wherever it makes sense, Nathan said. His voice had gone very quiet, the particular quiet of a man who is preparing himself for something difficult. I folded my hands on the table. Rachel had stopped crying. She was watching me with red-rimmed eyes and an expression that held no judgment whatsoever, which somehow made it harder to begin. The first Tuesday was about 6 weeks after Margaret passed, I said. Diane called ahead, asked if I'd eaten. I hadn't. She showed up with chicken and dumplings, Margaret's recipe, actually. I don't know how she got it. I didn't ask. Rachel's breath caught audibly a small, painful sound. We sat in this kitchen, I continued. And I talked. I talked about Margaret, about the house on Fieldcrest Drive, about whether I should sell it or rent it, about how strange it felt to make financial decisions alone after 41 years of making them with someone else. I looked at my hands. She asked very good questions, the kind of questions that feel like listening. What kind of questions? Nathan asked carefully. She asked which bank Margaret and I had always used. I told her First Capital we'd been with them since 1987. She nodded like it was just background, just conversation. I felt my jaw tighten. A few weeks later, she asked whether I had a financial advisor. I told her no, we'd always managed our own accounts. She said Derek knew some people if I was ever interested. I said I'd think about it. Nathan wrote nothing down. He had a memory like a steel trap when he chose to use it. She asked about the house value, I went on. I told her what the realtor estimated. When the sale finally closed, I told her the number 180,000 because she asked how it went, and I was proud of it. Margaret and I had bought that house for 62,000 in 1991. My voice thinned a little on that sentence, and I pressed through it. I told Diane about the account where I deposited the money. I described the folder where I kept the paperwork. I looked up. I told her about the test investment, the 10,000 I was considering putting somewhere as a trial to see how it performed before committing more. The sound Rachel made was not quite a word. She pressed her fist against her mouth hard. Nathan's face had gone very still, the kind of still that meant something was moving fast underneath it. Dad, the 10,000. You told Diane you were considering it. I told her I was thinking about it, yes. I told her the amount. I told her I hadn't decided yet which fund to try. I met my son's eyes and watched him put something together that turned his expression briefly raw before he controlled it back to neutral. I know what you're about to say. Derek knew that number. He said it out loud at the cookout, Nathan said. 170,000 remaining. He knew you had moved 10,000 already. That information did not exist anywhere except what you told Diane and what I knew. He exhaled through his nose a long, controlled breath. She fed him everything in real time, Dad. I know. The two words cost me something to say. They sat on the table between us like something that could not be taken back. Rachel lowered her fist from her mouth. Dad. Her voice broke through before she could catch herself past the point of careful past, the point of composed. She sat here every Tuesday, and you trusted her. That is not stupidity. That is grief. Those are completely different things. My eyes went hot, and I pressed the back of my hand briefly against them hard. 72 years old, and sitting at my kitchen table trying not to cry in front of my children. Margaret would have had something to say about that. Something fond and practical and slightly exasperated. So the worst part, I said, is that I enjoyed those Tuesdays. I looked forward to them. She never seemed bored. She never made me feel like a burden. I lowered my hand. And every time she left, she had a little more. Nathan leaned forward, elbows on the table. Did she ever ask about your password? Your PIN, anything directly account-related? Never. I shook my head. She was too smart for that. She never asked for anything she couldn't have gotten from a friendly conversation with an old man who missed his wife. I let that sentence hang for a moment, because it deserved to hang. She didn't need to steal it, Nathan. She waited for me to give it to her. And I did. Every single Tuesday for 14 months, Nathan reached across and put his hand over both of mine. It was such an un-Nathan gesture, he is not by nature a demonstrative man, that it startled me more than anything else that morning. His hand was warm and heavy and entirely certain. Dad, he said. Look at me. I looked at him. She chose you because you were alone and grieving and decent. That is not a character flaw. That is exactly what these people target. His voice was steady, but something underneath it was not, and I was glad he was not trying to hide that. She is the one who sat here week after week and extracted information from a man in pain. That is on her. Not on you. Rachel reached across from the other side and gripped my forearm. Her fingers were still trembling slightly, but her grip was firm. I sat between my two children with their hands on mine and felt the specific, complicated grief of a man who has been loved well and fooled badly, and is trying to hold both of those truths at the same time. Then Nathan straightened, and the moment passed into something more purposeful. There's one more piece, he said. And it's the piece I need you to see, Dad, because it changes everything about how we understand what Derek knows. He reached for his laptop. Nathan opened his laptop and turned the screen toward us without preamble. Yesterday at the cookout, he said, Derek said something that I have been turning over in my head since the moment it left his mouth. I need you both to hear it the way I heard it. He looked at me. Dad, do you remember exactly what Derek said when he was defending himself after I cut off the phone call? I pressed my fingers against my temple and pulled the memory forward. The afternoon light. The smell of charcoal cooling. Derek's voice measured and reasonable, the voice of a man who believed he was winning. He said something about the investment being modest, I said slowly. That the initial amount was small, that there was still plenty left. Word for word, Nathan said. He said, and I am quoting because I wrote it down the moment I got to my car. The initial transfer was modest 10,000. That still leaves 170,000 untouched. Surely that's enough security for a man your father's age. Nathan turned the laptop screen fully toward me. On it was a note he had typed time-stamped at 6:14 the previous evening. The quote sat there in black text, exact and immovable. Dad, who knew you were considering moving 10,000 as a test investment? My chest went cold. You, I said. And me. That's right. Nathan's voice was very controlled, the way a surgeon's hands are controlled, not because the work is easy, but because the work requires it. You told Diane you were thinking about a trial amount. You told her it was 10,000. That information went from you to Diane. But Diane did not know you had already made the decision to move exactly 10,000 and keep the remaining 170. That was a number that only existed inside your bank account. He let that land. Derek said 170,000 remaining. Not approximately 170. Not roughly that amount. 170,000, the precise figure left, after a $10,000 movement that you had not yet told anyone you had finalized. And that is the key, Dad. You told Diane you were considering moving 10,000 as a test. You never told her you had already done it. She did not know the transfer was complete. The only way Derek could know the exact remaining balance, not an estimate, not a round number, but the precise figure is if he had already looked at the account directly. Rachel's hand slammed flat on the table, not in anger exactly, but in the involuntary way a body responds when a truth hits it physically. He accessed Dad's account. Well, that is what the number suggests, yes. Nathan closed the laptop with a quiet final click. Under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, that's federal law, unauthorized access to someone's financial accounts is a felony. We're not talking about a civil matter. If Derek pulled Dad's account data without authorization, that is a federal crime. He looked at me steadily. Which means this is no longer just a family problem. I stood up from the table. I needed to move, needed to do something with the energy that was building in my legs, a restless, furious buzzing that had nowhere to go. I walked to the kitchen window and looked out at the backyard. The picnic table was still there from yesterday, the folding chairs still arranged in their semicircle around the cold grill. Everything looked exactly as we had left it. Nothing looked the same. He stood right next to me. I said to the window. He handed me that glass, and he stood right next to me, and he already knew. He already knew every number in my account. Dad. Nathan's voice came from behind me. Come back to the table. I turned around. My hands were trembling again, that same fine, uncontrollable shaking from the night before, but angrier now, less frightened and more furious. I pressed them against my thighs as I walked back and sat down. How do we prove it? I asked. The number itself is strong circumstantial evidence, Nathan said. Combined with the Harbor Crest connection, the staged phone call, the timing of everything, it builds a picture. But I'm not the right person to pursue this formally. The moment my own family became the target, I am too close to investigate it myself. He rubbed the back of his neck, a gesture I had not seen from him since he was a teenager wrestling with something. I can point the right people toward it. But there are steps we need to take first as a family before this becomes official. Rachel leaned forward on her elbows. What steps? We need to understand the full scope of what they were planning, what they actually have access to, what documents they may have copied. Nathan looked at me. And there is something else, Dad. Something I haven't said yet because I needed you to understand the financial piece first. The way he said it made the hair on my forearms lift. Say it, I told him. The phone call, the glass, the account access, those are about money. But the ring signal, Rachel, documented the fact that Derek had been communicating with Diane in a pattern that spans at least a year that is about something else. Nathan's jaw tightened. That is about a relationship that existed before any of us understood what we were looking at. Rachel made a sound beside me, low, involuntary, the sound of something tearing slowly. How long? I asked, even though I already knew I would not like the number. Nathan looked at his sister first, then at me. That depends on something Rachel found this morning, before she came here. He nodded at her. Tell him, Rachel. Rachel reached into the pocket of her jacket. Her fingers were still trembling as she drew out a small object wrapped in a paper napkin, careful, deliberate, the way you carry something that needs to stay exactly as you found it. She set it on the table between us. The napkin was folded into a small, neat square. Rachel had wrapped it carefully, the way she had wrapped everything careful since she was a little girl who kept her crayons sorted by color and her bookshelf arranged by height. She did not unwrap it herself. She pushed it toward Nathan. I found it this morning, she said, before I came here. Derek's registration sticker expired last month. I noticed it in the driveway when I was leaving, and I opened his glove compartment to look for the renewal card. Her voice was perfectly level, the levelness of enormous effort. It was sitting on top of the insurance papers. Nathan looked at the folded napkin for a moment before he touched it. Then he pulled it toward him and opened it with the careful, two-fingered handling of a man who had spent 20 years treating small objects as potential evidence. Inside was a silver lighter, slim, rectangular, the kind that sits flat in a shirt pocket. On the back face, an engraving in clean block letters, N and D, June 14th. I turned it over twice in my hands, trying to understand how it had gotten there. The only explanation I could find was the one I did not want to find, that Diane had given it to him herself. Kept it from Nathan, reported it lost, and passed it to Derek as something between a token and a signal. Nathan's hands went absolutely still. I knew that date. June 14th was the day he and Diane had been married 19 years ago, in a small ceremony at a garden venue in Annapolis. Margaret had worn a pale green dress. I had cried during the vows and pretended afterward that I had something in my eye. My son had looked at his bride the way a man looks at something he cannot believe is real. That's Diane's, I said, though my voice came out strange and hollow. She showed it to me once. Said it was a gift from your mother, Nathan. That your mother gave it to her at the rehearsal dinner. Nathan had not moved. He was looking at the engraving with an expression I had never seen on my son's face before, a raw, unguarded thing that he was not fast enough to cover, gone as quickly as it appeared, but leaving something behind in its wake like a watermark. She told me she lost it, he said. 8 months ago, she cried about it. A pause, short, contained. She said she looked everywhere. Rachel's chin was trembling. She pressed her teeth together to stop it. Derek's glove compartment, Nathan. Not her jewelry box. Not between the couch cushions. His glove compartment. Nathan set the lighter down on the table very gently, the engraving face up. He did not pick it up again. He looked at it the way you look at something that has just permanently rearranged the furniture of your understanding. How long has Derek had it? He said, not to either of us specifically, more to the air, to the question itself. I don't know, Rachel said. But she told you 8 months ago that she'd lost it, which means it's been in his car for at least 8 months, Nathan said. Minimum. I felt the kitchen pressing in around the three of us. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, a car passed on the street. Ordinary sounds absurd against what was sitting on my kitchen table. Nathan. I said his name the way I said it when he was a boy, and had fallen, and I needed him to look at me so I could tell him how badly he was hurt. "Talk to me." He looked up from the lighter. His eyes were dry, he would not cry. Here I knew that about my son the way I knew the sounds of my house, but there was a brightness in them that had nothing to do with happiness, a hot, pressurized quality that told me something enormous was being held very tightly behind a very controlled face. "I need a minute," he said. "Take it," I told him. He stood up, walked to the kitchen window. The same window I had stood at an hour ago, staring at the backyard, and put both hands flat on the counter. His back was to us. His shoulders were straight. I watched my son stand in my kitchen, with the worst kind of knowledge settling into him. The knowledge that something you believed in completely was never entirely what you thought it was. And I ached for him in a way that had no words attached to it, only weight. Rachel looked at me across the table. Her eyes were wet and wide, and asking me something I did not know how to answer. After perhaps 2 minutes, it felt longer the way the hardest minutes always do. Nathan turned back around. His face was composed. Not fine, not recovered, but composed the way a man looks when he has decided that falling apart is something he will do later, somewhere private, when the work in front of him is done. "All right," he said, returning to his chair. "Here's what the lighter tells us independent of everything else. It tells us that Derek and Diane have been meeting privately, without either of our knowledge, for at minimum 8 months. Probably longer." He looked at Rachel. "Which means the question is not just whether they were planning to take Dad's money. The question is how far back this goes. Because if Derek was already connected to Diane before he ever met you, then I was never the beginning," Rachel said. Her voice broke cleanly on the last word, cracked right down the center, and she pressed both hands against her face and breathed hard for several seconds, the way a person breathes when they are determined not to come apart completely. When she lowered her hands, her eyes were red and swollen, but her jaw was set. "I was the way in." Nathan reached across and gripped her shoulder. "We don't know that yet." "Don't," she shook her head. "Don't manage me, Nathan. I need you to be honest with me right now." He held her gaze for a moment. "We don't know the full timeline yet. But yes, it is possible that is what the evidence will show." Rachel nodded once sharply, like a person taking a punch they knew was coming and staying upright anyway. I reached out and covered her hand with mine, my daughter, who had kept that notebook for a year, who had driven to my house at dawn, who had wrapped that lighter in a napkin and carried it to me with hands that were already shaking before she walked through my door. "Whatever it shows," I told her, "you are not alone in it." She turned her hand over and squeezed mine back so hard I felt it all the way up my arm. Nathan was already reaching for his phone. "I need to make some calls. Not official, not yet. But I need to find out when Derek first contacted anyone in this family." He looked up. "And I need to know who reached out first." Nathan came back the following afternoon. I heard his car in the driveway just after 2 o'clock and went to put coffee on before he knocked. He had not slept. I could see that from across the kitchen in the gray cast beneath his eyes, and the particular set of his jaw that meant he had been working through something in his head for hours without stopping. He was carrying a thin manila folder, and he set it on the table the way he set everything important quietly, without drama, like a man who has learned that the weight of a thing does not require announcement. Rachel was already there. She had come back at noon without being asked, carrying sandwiches from the deli on Hillcrest that she knew I liked, and we had eaten without talking much, because some mornings use up all the words a person has and leave nothing spare for the afternoon. "I need to show you both something," Nathan said, sitting down and opening the folder. "And I need Rachel to hear this first before I explain what it means, because this part is about her." He looked at his sister across the table, and the steadiness in his eyes was the kind that costs something to maintain. "I'm sorry in advance." Rachel put down her coffee cup. Her shoulders squared, that particular bracing motion. She had the one that meant she was deciding to be stronger than she felt. "Just say it, Nathan." Derek was active in a professional financial networking group, a private online forum for consultants and advisors. But he was not the one who made first contact. "I need you to understand that before I show you the rest." Nathan placed a printed page on the table. "The first message in their exchange is dated 14 months before Derek ever met you, Rachel. 14 months before your first date. Before he knew your name officially." He tapped the page. In that first message, he introduced himself as a specialist in estate planning for high-net-worth clients approaching retirement. He asked if Diane knew anyone in her network who might benefit from a consultation. Rachel's breath left her in a slow, audible stream, the sound of air going out of something that had been holding itself inflated for too long. Her hands gripped the edge of the table. She answered him. Nathan continued. She responded within 2 hours. She mentioned that her father-in-law was approaching a significant property sale. She mentioned the approximate value. She mentioned that he lived alone and that his children were, and I'm quoting her message here, well-meaning but not closely involved in his day-to-day finances. The words hit me like something physical. My chest tightened so hard I had to press my fist against my sternum. No, she said that about us. Rachel's voice cracked on the last word like a green branch bent past its limit. She told a stranger that we weren't involved. She told a stranger exactly how to walk in, Nathan said. After that first exchange, they moved the conversation off the forum platform. We have fragments enough to establish the timeline and the intent, but not every message. How much did she tell him about me? Rachel asked. Her voice had dropped to something barely above a whisper, and I could hear the trembling underneath it, the very fine vibration of a person holding themselves together with tremendous effort. Nathan exhaled. She told him you had recently ended a long relationship, that you were spending more time alone, that you were, in her words, open to something genuine. He closed his eyes briefly, one short, pained closure, then opened them again. He asked which social events you attended. She told him. He arranged to be at the Annapolis Harbor Festival the following May, the one where you told us you met him by chance when he asked for directions to the dock. Rachel's hand came up and covered her mouth. A sound escaped her anyway, high involuntary, the sound of something breaking cleanly in the center of the chest. Tears spilled down both cheeks simultaneously, and she did not try to stop them this time, did not wipe them with the back of her wrist or press her fist against her eyes. She just sat there with both hands over her mouth while they ran freely down her face and dripped off her jaw. I was out of my chair before I decided to move. I went around the table and put my hands on her shoulders from behind, and she reached up and gripped both my forearms with fingers that dug in like she needed something solid to keep from floating away. He asked for directions, she said, muffled behind her hands. He asked me which way the dock was, and I thought it was funny. I thought it was charming that a man who looked that confident didn't know where he was going. Rachel. Nathan started. He knew exactly where he was going. She dropped her hands from her face and turned to look at me over her shoulder, and the expression on her face was one of the most painful things I have ever seen. Not devastation, exactly, but the specific, particular anguish of a person watching something they believed in rewrite itself into something unrecognizable. He practiced that. Dad, he practiced asking me for directions. I tightened my grip on her shoulders. Yes, I said, because she needed honesty more than comfort, and I loved her enough to give her both. He did. Nathan reached across the table and placed his palm flat over Rachel's hand. The festival, the follow-up coffee, the first dinner, all of it was already mapped out before he said a word to you. But Rachel. He waited until she'd looked at him. What you felt was real. Your response to him was genuine. He manipulated the circumstances. He did not manufacture your heart. Rachel pulled in a breath that shuddered all the way through her. That distinction doesn't make it hurt less. No. Nathan agreed. It doesn't. I know that. She wiped her face with both hands hard and thorough, the gesture of a woman who is grief-stricken and furious in equal measure, and has decided the fury is more useful right now. She straightened in her chair. Her eyes were swollen and bright. What else? She said. Nathan looked at her for a moment, with something in his expression that I could only call love, the specific, protective, helpless love of an older brother who cannot undo what has already been done. There's a second folder, he said, and this one isn't about Derek. He looked at me. Dad, this part is about Diane. And what I found changes the shape of everything we thought we understood about how this started. Before I tell you what Nathan found in that second folder, the part that changed everything, I need to pause for just a moment. What comes next surprised even me, and I was the one living it. If you are still here, drop a 9 in the comments. Just that. It tells me you are still with me, and after everything this family went through, that means something. Quick note, this story contains some fictional elements crafted for reflection and life lessons. If that is not for you, this is a good moment to step away. But if you are staying, what comes next, you will not see coming. Nathan placed the second folder on the table. It was thinner than the first, perhaps a dozen pages, and he did not open it immediately. He sat with both hands resting on top of it and looked at the wall behind my head for exactly 3 seconds, in a way that told me he was choosing his words with the same care a demolitions expert uses choosing which wire to cut. Everything I'm about to tell you, he said, I have verified independently. I am not guessing. I am not inferring. What's in this folder is documented. He finally looked down and opened it. We assumed Derek was the initiator, that he found Diane somehow and recruited her, that she was at minimum a willing participant who got pulled in. He turned the first page toward us. That assumption is wrong. Rachel leaned forward. Her eyes were still red-rimmed from earlier, still carrying that raw, scoured quality of someone who has cried hard, and recently, but her attention was razor-sharp. Diane contacted Derek first, Nathan said, before he ever posted anything in that networking group, before he identified our family as a target. She reached out to him directly through a professional platform. This is the record of that initial message. He pointed to a line of text on the page. She introduced herself. She mentioned that she was married to a federal agent. She described her father-in-law's upcoming property sale in general terms. And she asked whether Derek's practice handled private wealth management for elderly clients with, and this is her phrasing, limited family oversight. The last 3 words dropped into the room like stones into still water. Limited family oversight, I repeated. My voice came out scraped and hollow. She used those words about me. She used those words about all of us, Nathan said. She was telling him that the target was accessible, that there was no close family monitoring, that the path was clear. He turned another page. Derek responded within 24 hours. They exchanged 8 messages over the following 2 weeks. In that time, Diane gave him your bank, the approximate sale amount, your health status, your daily routine, and my work schedule, including my travel dates for the next quarter. Rachel's hand slammed flat on the table for the second time in 2 days. She gave him Nathan's travel schedule, so Derek would know exactly when Nathan was out of state, I said, and the understanding of it moved through me like cold water through a cracked pipe, slow, thorough, reaching every corner. So he could approach me during the windows when Nathan was least likely to appear. Yes. Nathan's voice was entirely flat now. Not cold, not angry, just stripped of inflection, the way a room is stripped of furniture. He was doing what he did at work, I understood, removing himself from the material so he could handle it cleanly. She provided operational intelligence. Before she ever met Derek in person, before there was anything between them beyond a business arrangement to extract money from her own family, I pushed back from the table and stood up. I needed height, needed to be standing rather than sitting with this information pressing down on me. I walked 3 steps toward the window, stopped, turned back. Rachel was staring at the folder with an expression I could not fully read, something layered and complicated that kept shifting between grief and fury and a kind of terrible, sorrowful comprehension. Nathan. I said his name quietly. How are you doing with this? He looked up at me. For one unguarded moment, perhaps a second and a half, his face showed me something that had no professional distance in it whatsoever. Something that was simply a husband, sitting at a table learning that his wife had spent their marriage building an exit strategy around his own blind spots. Then it was gone. He straightened, almost imperceptibly. I'm working, he said. I know you are. I came back to the table and sat down. That's not what I asked. He held my gaze for a beat longer than comfortable. I'll answer that question later, Dad. In a different room on a different day. A pause. Right now, I need to finish this. I nodded. A father learns when to push and when to let his child set the pace. This was not a moment for pushing. After the initial exchange, Nathan continued turning back to the folder. Diane and Derek moved their communication to encrypted messaging. We have less visibility there, but we have enough. He pulled out a single page near the back, a printout of what appeared to be a brief email, the kind people send when they have forgotten that professional platforms archive everything. This was sent from Diane's work account, not her personal email, her work account, approximately 9 months ago. She was asking Derek for confirmation that the financial power of attorney template he'd sent her was the correct version for Maryland state law. Nathan placed the page flat on the table and pressed his index finger against it. She was already preparing the paperwork. 9 months ago, while I was eating dinner across the table from her every night, Rachel made a sound that was not quite a word, a low, grief-saturated exhalation that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than her lungs. She sat at my kitchen table, I said. The sentences were coming out simple now, stripped to their bones, the way Nathan's voice had been stripped. She sat in this kitchen every Tuesday for over a year and told me my children were too busy for me, and the whole time she was building the file, Nathan said. Yes, I pressed both palms flat against the tabletop and looked at my hands. The same hands that had passed her the salt at 100 family dinners. That had helped her carry groceries in from the car. That had held her coat while she put it on at the end of Thanksgiving evenings. I want to ask you something, Rachel said to Nathan. Her voice had gone very quiet and very deliberate. And I need you to answer it honestly, not protectively. Ask, did you ever suspect her? Not now, not looking back, in real time. Did you ever feel something was off? Nathan was quiet for a moment, that had texture to it that was not empty but full of something being carefully examined. Once, he said. About a year ago. She was on her phone and I came into the room and she put it face down. I thought for about 4 seconds, I thought something. Then she smiled and asked if I wanted her to reheat dinner, and I told myself I was bringing work home. His mouth pressed into a line. 4 seconds. That was all I gave it. Rachel reached across the table and put her hand over his. She counted on that, she said. She counted on you trusting her. That's not a failure. That's marriage. Nathan turned his hand over and held hers back, and the two of them stayed like that, while the afternoon light shifted in my kitchen. The lawnmower started up with a sound so ordinary, it was almost offensive. There is one more thing, Nathan said finally. About the dinners. About the times we didn't come. He looked at me. Dad, I need you to tell me something. The anniversary of Mom's passing, the first one, you told me you weren't feeling well, that you wanted to be alone. My stomach contracted. I never said that. Nathan's eyes went very still. Then we need to talk about who did. We moved to the kitchen as the afternoon darkened into evening, not because anyone suggested it, but because that is where our family has always gone when something needed to be said properly. Nathan put on the overhead light. Rachel found leftover soup in my refrigerator and heated it without asking. I sat at the head of the table and watched my children move around my kitchen and felt beneath all the grief and fury of the past 2 days a complicated and painful gratitude that they were here. The anniversary dinner. Nathan said, settling into his chair with a bowl he would barely touch. Walk me through what actually happened, Dad. Your version. I set the table for 3, I said. I made Margaret's pot roast, the one she always made for occasions she considered important. I waited from 5 o'clock until 7, then I put the food away and went to bed. I looked at my hands around my coffee mug. I thought you had both simply forgotten. I told myself it was understandable, that you had your own lives. Rachel made a sound like something tearing. Nathan called me that afternoon. She said, her voice tight and shaking. Diane told him you'd phoned her in the morning, that you weren't feeling well, that you specifically asked for the evening to yourself. She pressed her fingers against her lips hard. I tried to call you twice, Dad. It went to voicemail. I thought you'd turned the ringer off because you wanted quiet. My ringer was on all evening, I said. Rachel's eyes flooded. She forwarded your calls, didn't she? She had access to your phone settings somehow, and she... Her voice broke, completely splintered into pieces, and she pressed both hands over her face and breathed in sharp, ragged pulls, her shoulders heaving with the effort of containing something too large for the body holding it. Rachel. Nathan reached over and gripped the back of her neck gently, the way he used to when she was small and frightened. Breathe. She pulled her hands down. Her face was wet and red and furious. I sat home alone that night because I thought Dad wanted to grieve privately. And he was sitting here alone because he thought we'd forgotten Mom. Her fist hit the table not hard, but with a helpless, anguished force. She took that from us, Nathan. She took the one night that was supposed to be about Mom. The pain of that moved through me like something seismic, deep and foundational and impossible to ignore. Margaret's first anniversary. I had spent it alone at a set table with pot roast going cold, and my children had spent it apart from me, believing I had chosen that, and Diane had spent it wherever she spent it, knowing exactly what she had arranged. How many times? I asked. My voice came out older than usual, scraped thin. How many times did she do this? Nathan pulled out his phone and read from a list he had compiled. Thanksgiving, she called Rachel and said you were tired, not feeling social. Christmas Eve, she told me you'd decided to spend it quietly with just the two of them. Your birthday in March, she told Rachel you'd made plans with neighbors. The fishing weekend I suggested in April, she told me you'd said your knees were too bad for the boat. He set the phone down. I counted 11 occasions in 14 months where one or both of us were told you didn't want company. 11 times we stayed away because we thought that was what you needed. 11 times. I sat with that number and felt it settle into me like sediment into still water. And every time, I said slowly, she would show up an hour later, sometimes less, with food or flowers or just herself, saying she knew the kids were busy but she wanted to check on me, because she'd just created the vacancy, Nathan said, and the flatness in his voice was the flatness of a man who is very, very angry and has chosen to express it as precision. She manufactured your loneliness and then filled it herself, systematically. Over more than a year, Rachel pushed back from the table abruptly and stood up, wrapping her arms around herself. She walked to the kitchen window, not to look at anything, just to move, just to put her body somewhere. It could hold the enormous, awful shape of what we were understanding. She told me you didn't want us there, Rachel said to the dark glass. And she told you we were too busy to come, and none of us ever picked up the phone and called each other directly to check. Her voice fractured on the last word. We just believed her. We all just believed her because why would she lie about that? Why would anyone lie about that? Because it worked, Nathan said. And because she needed you isolated from us, Dad. Not just for the money, for the paperwork. For the moment she needed you to sign something, and there was no one close enough to ask you whether you were sure. I looked at my son across the table. She was building toward the power of attorney, yes. Nathan's jaw tightened. She needed to be the only person you fully trusted, the only person you turned to. She needed enough distance between you and us that when she handed you a document, you wouldn't think to call either of us first. He exhaled hard through his nose. She nearly had it, Dad. Another few weeks and she would have had it completely. Rachel turned back from the window. Her eyes were dry now, that particular dryness that comes after crying so much. The body simply runs out, leaving something harder and cleaner behind. What do we do? She asked. Nathan looked at her, then at me. When he spoke, his voice had shifted into something that was neither FBI agent nor grieving husband, but something older and more fundamental, a son sitting at his father's table deciding what came next. We need to understand one more thing first, he said, because there's a part of this that none of us have talked about yet. The part that tells us what Diane and Derek were really afraid of. He looked at me with an expression I could not immediately name. Dad, did you ever suspect her before any of this, at any point? I looked at my coffee mug, at my hands, at the table Margaret had picked out at an estate sale in 2003 because she said it had good bones. Yes, I said. I did. Nathan stared at me. Rachel turned from the window so fast her shoulder caught the curtain. What did you just say? Nathan asked. I said yes. I kept my voice level, though my heart was knocking steadily against my ribs. Not from fear, but from the particular tension of a man who has been holding something carefully for a long time and is finally setting it down. I suspected her. Before the cookout. Before any of this. Nathan leaned forward slowly, both forearms on the table. How long ago? 3 weeks before the BBQ, I said. I can tell you the exact Tuesday. She came with chicken soup. I had mentioned a slight cold the week before, and she remembered, which was the kind of thing she always did, that I found touching. We were talking about the Fieldcrest sale, about where I was thinking of putting the money long term. And she asked me. I paused, making sure I had the words exactly right. She asked me which branch of First Capital I used, which physical branch on which street. Rachel crossed back to the table and sat down hard. She asked for the branch location. Yes, and here's the thing. I looked at both my children. I had never told her I used First Capital. Not the name. I had talked around it, my bank. The bank where Margaret and I always kept things. But I had never said the name out loud to her. Not once. I pressed my palm flat on the table. She knew the name of my bank, which meant she had gotten it somewhere else. And the only somewhere else was that she had gone looking. Nathan's jaw tightened so hard, I could see the muscle jump beneath his skin. You didn't react. I smiled and said the branch on Maple Avenue, I said. Then I changed the subject to the weather. And that evening after she left, I sat in this chair, and I thought very carefully about what I was going to do next. Dad. Nathan's voice was rough, scraped around the edges. Why didn't you tell me? I looked at my son steadily. Because I wasn't certain yet. Because I am a man who believes you do not accuse your daughter-in-law of planning to steal from you based on one wrong question. And because I took a breath. Because if I was wrong, I was about to tear this family apart over nothing. I needed to be sure. Rachel's eyes were bright and intent. What did you do? The following week I moved everything. I said it simply because it was a simple thing, or it had seemed simple at the time in the way that necessary things sometimes do. Every original document, the closing papers from Fieldcrest, the account statements, the investment records, everything that had been in that right-hand drawer. I put it all in a large envelope, and I drove it to my attorney's office on a Wednesday afternoon, and I told Carol at the front desk I needed to store some documents in their safe, and I would explain everything to Robert when I had more information. Nathan pressed both hands over his face and held them there for a moment, a gesture so un-Nathan, so unguarded, that Rachel reached over and touched his arm. You moved the documents before the BBQ, Nathan said from behind his hands. 3 weeks before. Yes. He lowered his hands. His eyes were red at the rims, not from crying, but from the particular strain of processing too much, too fast. And the papers still in the drawer were copies, I said. With the correct account number, but the wrong bank routing information. Enough to look real. Not enough to actually move money. Rachel let out a breath that was almost a laugh, astonished, short, slightly broken at the edges. Dad, you set a trap. I set the beginning of one, I said carefully. I didn't know yet what I was trapping or how. I only knew that something was wrong, and I needed to understand what before I could do anything about it. I looked at Nathan. That is why I needed you. What I could do alone was limited. What came next required someone who understood how these things work. Nathan straightened in his chair. The raw, overwhelmed quality around his eyes had not disappeared, but it had organized itself into something more purposeful. The way grief sometimes finds its shape in action when sitting still becomes unbearable. You knew something was wrong, he said. You protected the documents. You kept your reaction hidden so she wouldn't know you were on to her. He exhaled. Dad, why didn't you trust me enough to... I trust you completely, I said, and I meant it without reservation. But I had one advantage that you didn't. I was the person she thought was fooled. The moment you knew that advantage disappeared. She was watching you carefully. Nathan, you said yourself she tracked your travel schedule. If you had started behaving differently around her before we had everything in place, we would have lost the one thing working in our favor. Nathan held my gaze for a long moment. Something moved through his expression, complicated, layered, equal parts, professional respect, and something more personal that I recognized as the particular way a child looks at a parent when they discover a depth they had not previously measured. So what comes next? Rachel said, is something we design together. Yes. I reached into the pocket of my cardigan and placed a small brass key on the table between us, the key to my attorney's safe, which I had been carrying for 3 weeks. But first, both of you need to understand something else about what Derek and Diane were planning to do to each other. Because that is where the opening is. Nathan picked up the brass key from the table and turned it over in his fingers once before setting it back down. Before we talk about what comes next, he said, there's something you both need to understand about the people we're dealing with. Because what I'm about to tell you changes how we approach everything. He reached into his folder and produced 2 more pages, both printouts, both brief. Derek and Diane are not a united front. They never were. Rachel pulled the pages toward her. Her eyes moved quickly across the first one, then slowed on the second. Derek has recordings, Nathan said. Audio files, at least 14 hours of conversations between himself and Diane going back 8 months. He stored them on a cloud server registered to a shell account. The content covers everything: the original plan. The execution details the power of attorney preparation, the harbor crest structure. He paused. He has been building an insurance policy against Diane since the beginning. If this goes wrong, he intended to hand prosecutors a complete confession from her and walk away, positioning himself as a reluctant participant who was manipulated. Rachel looked up from the page. He was going to sacrifice her. From day one, Nathan said. He never trusted her. He used her because she had access he couldn't get any other way. But he was always prepared to burn her if the situation required it. I leaned forward. And Diane. 6 weeks ago, Diane opened a separate checking account at a credit union in Rockville. Nathan tapped the second page. Single signatory. Derek's name is not on it. She has been moving small amounts into it, nothing large enough to trigger reporting requirements, which in the United States means keeping each transfer under $10,000 to avoid mandatory bank reporting under the Bank Secrecy Act. 15 transfers over 6 weeks. The total sitting in that account right now is approximately $42,000. Rachel's breath hissed through her teeth. She was already stealing from him. Yeah, she was positioning herself to disappear without him, Nathan said. They told each other they were partners. They told each other they would leave together after the money was secured. But Diane had a private account Derek didn't know about, and Derek had recordings Diane didn't know about. He looked at me. 2 people who planned to rob you were also planning to rob each other. And neither of them knows, the other has found out. I sat back in my chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. The light fixture up there was the same one Margaret had chosen in 1998, simple brushed nickel, nothing fancy. She had said she wanted something that would still look right in 20 years. She had been correct, as she usually was, about things that mattered. So they are both waiting. I said, for the moment they can move first. Yes, Nathan said. Which means they are both watching for signs that the plan is on track. They need Dad to sign the power of attorney. Once that happens, Diane can initiate the transfer, and whoever moves first gets the money, and the other one is left holding the evidence. Rachel set the pages down on the table and pressed both palms flat over them, as though the information needed to be held in place. So, if we can make them believe the plan is working, make them think Dad is about to sign, they will rush. And when people rush, they get careless. That is exactly right, Nathan said. He looked at me. But it only works if Derek and Diane believe Dad has become exactly what they need him to be. Confused enough, isolated enough, trusting enough. He paused. Which means somebody has to sell that to Diane convincingly enough that she tells Derek and Derek believes it, and they both decide the moment has arrived. The kitchen was warm and quiet around us. Outside, the September night had settled into that particular stillness that comes just before the season fully turns the last of the crickets. The smell of cooling leaves, the sense of something ending and something else not yet begun. "I can do that," I said. Nathan looked at me. "Dad, I am 72 years old, and I have been watching people my entire life." I met my son's eyes without flinching. I know how to let someone see what they want to see. I have been doing it with Diane for 3 weeks already without her noticing. I picked up the brass key and held it. I need to give her a performance that makes her certain the window is open. That means I need to seem confused, forgetful, ready to hand everything over. I set the key down. "And I need Rachel for the part that comes after." Rachel's chin lifted. "Tell me what you need." "Not yet," Nathan said, and his voice had the particular focused quality it carried when he was building something carefully. "Before we talk about what each of us does, I need to show you what Dad already put in place, because there's a piece of this that he hasn't told us yet." He looked at me steadily. "The copy's in the drawer. You said the routing information was wrong. But there's more to it than that, isn't there, Dad?" I reached into my cardigan pocket and produced a small envelope, white, unsealed, my handwriting on the front in blue ink. I placed it on the table between us. "There is considerably more," I said. Nathan picked up the envelope and looked at my handwriting on the front. Then he opened it. Inside were 3 sheets of paper folded together. He unfolded them and spread them flat on the table, and Rachel leaned in from her side to read. I watched their faces as they went through the pages, Nathan's jaw tightening incrementally with each paragraph, Rachel's hand coming up slowly to cover her mouth. "You wrote this down," Nathan said finally. "You wrote down everything you observed. Dated entries, starting 3 weeks before the BBQ. 4 weeks, actually," I said. "I started the Tuesday she asked about the bank branch. I have been keeping notes in the same way I kept field records when I worked at the surveying office, dates, times, exact quotes where I could remember them, behavioral observations." I folded my hands on the table. "I am old Nathan. I am not stupid." Rachel made a sound that was half laugh and half sob, pressing her fingers harder against her mouth. "The copy's in the drawer," Nathan said, pointing to a line on the second page. "You wrote here that you replaced the account routing number with the routing code for a closed account. A real routing number, just not yours. First Capital closed that branch in 2019, I said. The routing number still exists in their archived system. It looks legitimate at a glance. But any attempt to initiate a transfer using it would return an error at the processing stage." I paused. "They would think they had everything they needed. They would try to move the money, and nothing would move." Nathan sat back in his chair and looked at me with an expression I had not seen from him since he was perhaps 12 years old, and I had shown him how to read a topographic map by feel rather than sight. Pure, uncomplicated astonishment. "Dad," he said. "Your mother used to say I was thorough to the point of stubbornness," I said. She was not wrong. Rachel dropped her hand from her mouth and laughed a real laugh, this time startled out of her, bright and slightly wet at the edges from everything that had preceded it. "Dad, you are the most, I don't even have the word for what you are." 72 years old, I said. With a very good memory and a great deal of time on Tuesday evenings. Nathan pressed his fist against his own mouth for a moment, collecting himself. When he lowered it, his eyes were bright. Not with tears exactly, but with something adjacent to them, something that lived in the same neighborhood. "The power of attorney she's planning to bring you," he said. In Maryland, a durable financial power of attorney requires the principal, that's you, Dad, to sign in front of a notary public and two witnesses who are not related to you and have no financial interest in the document. It cannot simply be signed at a kitchen table and taken away. He leaned forward. She knows this, which means she has a notary arranged, which means the moment you tell her you're ready to sign, she will produce a complete setup, witnesses, notary, everything faster than anyone should be able to. Which tells us she has been ready for some time, I said. Which tells us she has been ready for some time, Nathan confirmed. And that kind of preparation takes weeks, possibly months. He straightened. So here is what I think needs to happen. And Dad, this has to be your decision, yours alone, not because Rachel and I don't have a stake in it, but because you are the one who has to carry the performance. He looked at me directly. Diane comes on Tuesday. That is 4 days from now. I think you need to let her believe the moment has arrived. Rachel's back straightened. What exactly does that mean? Yeah, it means Dad tells her he has been feeling confused, Nathan said. That the finances are overwhelming him. That he has been thinking about her offer to help and he has decided he is ready. He asks her to bring the paperwork. Nathan's voice was steady, but his eyes were alive with something focused and cold and purposeful. She will call Derek within the hour. Derek will begin moving pieces into position, and they will both believe they have finally won. I thought about Margaret's pot roast sitting cold on a set table. I thought about 11 family occasions that never happened. I thought about every Tuesday afternoon and the careful, practiced warmth of a woman who had studied my grief like a subject and used it like a key. I can do this, I said. My voice did not shake. I was surprised to find that it didn't, and then I was not surprised at all. I have been doing it for 4 weeks. 4 more days is nothing. Rachel reached across and gripped my forearm with both hands, her fingers pressing in hard. You are not doing it alone, she said fiercely. Not for 1 second of it. No, Nathan said. None of us are. He began gathering the pages back into the envelope with careful, deliberate movements. But before Tuesday, we need Rachel's part of this in place, because the end of this does not happen in this kitchen. He looked at his sister. It happens somewhere they choose to go, somewhere they feel safe, and we need to give them a reason to go there. Rachel released my arm and sat up very straight. The grief and the exhaustion and the red-rimmed eyes were still there, but underneath all of it, something had hardened into something clear and unbreakable, and entirely her mother's daughter. I know a place, she said, and I know exactly how to get Derek to take me there. The 4 days between Wednesday and the following Tuesday were the longest I had spent since the week after Margaret died. We used the time well. Nathan spent Thursday and Friday making calls he described only in general terms. Contacts, he said, people who owed him professional consideration and were willing to provide certain technical assistance without formal paperwork. Rachel came over Saturday morning, and we sat at the kitchen table for 3 hours, working through every detail of what needed to happen, and in what order, speaking quietly, even though we were alone in the house, the way people speak when they are planning something that feels too fragile for a normal voice. You have to give her just enough, Rachel said, her coffee cooling in her hands. Not too much at once. If you hand her everything in one conversation, she'll be suspicious. She'll wonder why, now why, so suddenly. I know how to pace it, I said. I have been watching her pace things for 14 months. Rachel looked at me across the table with an expression that was equal parts pride and grief. I know you do, Dad. I keep thinking about you sitting here with her, being kind to her while she stopped. Her jaw tightened. I don't know how you're going to do it without letting her see. Because I think about your mother, I said simply. and about you and Nathan. And that is larger than anything I feel about Diane. Rachel's eyes went bright and wet at the corners, but she pressed her lips together and nodded, and we moved on to the next detail because there were many details, and the Tuesday visit would not wait for grief. Nathan joined us Sunday evening with the last piece of the technical arrangement confirmed. He sat down, drank the coffee I put in front of him in 3 long swallows, and said, "We're ready. Dad, when Diane comes Tuesday, you know what to do. Rachel, your part happens after we'll give it 2 weeks. Enough time for Derek and Diane to move into position, enough time for them to get comfortable believing they've won." "And the lake house?" I asked. Rachel's expression shifted into something that was not quite a smile, too complicated, too weighted to be called that simply. "Leave that to me." Tuesday came the way difficult things always come too quickly, once the waiting was over, preceded by a morning of complete ordinary stillness that felt almost insulting in its normalcy. I made oatmeal. I read the newspaper. I watered the plant on the kitchen windowsill that Margaret had started from a cutting 20 years ago, and that I had kept alive through sheer stubborn attention. At 10:37, Diane's car turned into my driveway. I heard the engine, heard the car door, heard her footsteps on the porch, and I took one breath, slow and deliberate, and I became the man she needed me to be. Not Walter Harrison, who had been keeping notes for 4 weeks. Not the father who had spent 4 days planning with his children. A confused old man, slightly unmoored, slightly overwhelmed, reaching toward the person who had always seemed to understand. She came in carrying lentil soup in a thermal container, and a smile that reached all the way to its edges. "Walter," she said warmly, setting the container on the counter. "You look tired. Are you sleeping?" "Not well," I said, and this at least was true. "Come sit down, Diane. I've been wanting to talk to you." She sat across from me, arranged herself in Rachel's chair, folded her hands with the attentive patience of someone very good at waiting. Something moved behind her eyes, a quick, calibrated alertness that she covered with concern so smoothly that I would have missed it entirely 6 months ago. "What's on your mind?" she asked gently. I rubbed my hand over my face, a gesture I had seen my own father use when he was genuinely worn down, and I borrowed it now because it was true enough that it would read as authentic. "The accounts," I said. "The paperwork. All of it. I sit down to look at the statements and I lose track. The numbers don't arrange themselves the way they used to." I paused. Margaret always handled the details. I let the sentence trail. "I've been thinking about what you offered, about letting you help." Diane leaned forward almost imperceptibly, just a fraction of an inch, just the slight forward incline of a person who has been waiting for a specific word and has now heard it. Her voice stayed warm and entirely unchanged. "Of course," she said. "That's what I'm here for, Walter. Whatever you need. I think I need someone to take over the management of it," I said. I let my voice carry a slight waver, not dramatic, just the honest uncertainty of a man who is genuinely asking for help, which was a feeling I knew from the inside and could render faithfully. The decisions, the transfers, all of it. I keep worrying I'll make a mistake and lose something Margaret and I worked for. Diane's hand moved across the table and covered mine. Her touch was warm and practiced and entirely without hesitation. "You won't have to worry about any of that," she said. "I can take care of everything. We just need to get the right paperwork in order. It's very straightforward, really. I actually have some documents that could simplify things enormously. I've been holding on to them in case you ever felt ready." She opened her bag. I watched her hand move inside it and felt my pulse in my ears steady. Controlled the heartbeat of the man who has already decided the outcome. and is simply watching the machinery of another person's certainty move toward its conclusion. She produced a slim folder and set it on the table between us with the careful, understated manner of someone presenting a gift. It's a durable financial power of attorney, she said. Standard Maryland form. It would allow me to handle your accounts on your behalf when things feel overwhelming. We just need to have it notarized. I know a notary, it would take almost no time. She opened the folder to the signature page and slid it gently toward me. Whenever you're ready, Walter. No pressure at all. I looked at the document. My name was already filled in. Her name was already filled in as agent. The form was complete, correctly formatted under Maryland law with 2 witness signature lines left blank alongside the notary acknowledgement block. She had prepared this months ago. Everything Nathan had predicted was sitting in front of me on my own kitchen table. Let me read it first, I said. My eyes aren't what they were. Give me a few days. Her smile did not flicker. Of course. Take all the time you need. But I saw her hand return to her bag, and I saw her fingers close around her phone inside it. And I knew with the same certainty I had known everything else for 4 weeks, that she would be sending a message to Derek before she reached the end of my driveway. I walked her to the door. I thanked her for the soup. I watched her car back out and disappear around the corner. Then I picked up my phone and called Nathan. She brought the paperwork, I said. It's already drafted. Everything. Then we moved to Rachel's part. 2 weeks passed. I know that sounds simple, 2 weeks. But I want you to understand what those 2 weeks felt like from the inside. Diane came on her regular Tuesday. I let her read me portions of the power of attorney document over chamomile tea, and I asked questions that were slightly off target, slightly confused, the questions of a man whose grip on financial complexity was loosening at the edges. She was patient and warm and thorough, and I sat across from her and felt nothing but the cold, clarifying fury of a man who knows exactly what he is looking at and has chosen to keep that knowledge entirely behind his eyes. Nathan checked in daily, never at the house, always by phone, always brief. The technical pieces were moving. The people he had contacted were in position. All that remained was Rachel. She came to me on a Wednesday morning in the 3rd week of October, 2 days before she intended to make her move. She sat in her usual chair and wrapped her hands around her coffee mug and looked at me with an expression I had not seen on her face since she was perhaps 8 years old and had broken a neighbor's window with a baseball and had come home to tell me before anyone else could. I need you to know something before I do this, she said. Tell me, I said. When I hand Derek that key, every part of me is going to want to take it back. Her voice was, but her knuckles had gone white around the mug. Because whatever else he is, I spent 2 years believing I loved him. And handing him a key and watching him think he's won, that's going to feel like the worst thing I've ever done. Not because I'm wrong about what he deserves. She looked up at me. But because I'm going to have to smile while I do it. I reached across and covered her hands with mine. You don't have to smile, I said. You just have to be angry enough to be convincing. And you are angry enough. I know you are. Something moved through her face, not quite a smile, and not quite tears, something directly between the two. I am furious, Dad, she said. I am so furious I can barely eat. Good, I said. Use it. She came back Friday evening and sat at my kitchen table and told me everything. I want to tell it to you the way she told it to me in her own words, as close as I can reconstruct them. Because Rachel has never been a woman who embellishes, and the plain version of what she did that afternoon was remarkable enough without decoration. She called Derek at noon and told him she needed to see him. Not alone, she said she wanted Diane there too. She said she needed to say something to both of them, and she wanted to say it once. They met at Derek's house, her house, or what had been her house, a place she had chosen and furnished, and lived in, and would now need to disentangle herself from one item at a time. She had driven there knowing all of that, and had walked through the front door anyway. Nathan has gone too far, she told them. Her voice, she said, came out harder than she expected, less performance than she anticipated, because the anger was real and it found the words on its own. He has been treating Derek like a criminal from the moment he walked into Dad's backyard with a glass of wine. He has made Dad paranoid, he has made this family suspicious of everyone, and I am done defending him. Derek watched her. Diane watched her. Rachel said she could feel them both calibrating, deciding whether this was genuine, whether this was the moment they had been positioned for. I found a lake house, Rachel said. About 90 minutes north up past Thurmont. It's been in the Harrison family for years. Nobody uses it anymore. It's just sitting there. I've been thinking about using it as a place to get away from all of this for a while. She paused, looked at Derek directly, kept her voice flat and wounded and entirely convincing. I want you to have the key. I need space from Nathan, and I think you two do too. Go up there this weekend if you want. Honestly, just go. She reached into her pocket and held out the key. Derek's hand came up and took it. Rachel said that was the hardest moment, not the speech, not the anger, not walking into that house knowing what she knew. The hardest moment was feeling the key leave her fingers, watching Derek close his hand around it, and watching Diane in her peripheral vision lift her chin by a fraction of an inch in a gesture of private, satisfied certainty. Rachel drove home. She pulled into my driveway, turned off the engine, and sat in her car for 7 minutes before she came inside. She told me this because she thought I should know it, that she had needed those 7 minutes to separate what she had done from what she had felt doing it. She came in through the front door, and her eyes were dry, but her face was the face of someone who has just carried something very heavy across a very long distance and has finally set it down. It's done, she said. He took it. I stood up from my chair and went to her and held her the way I had held her when she was a child. And something had hurt her both arms without qualification for as long as she needed. She pressed her face against my shoulder and breathed in 2 slow, shaking pulls that were not quite sobs, but were close enough to count. You did exactly right, I told her. I know, she said, muffled against my shoulder. That's the part that hurts. I held her for another minute. Then she straightened and wiped her face with the back of her wrist and said, When do we go? I looked at the calendar on the kitchen wall. Margaret's handwriting still on several of the dates appointments she had written in and never gotten to keep. The weekend, Derek and Diane would go to the lake house, and the day after. Sunday, I said. We go Sunday, and we end this. We arrived 2 hours before them. The lake house sat at the end of a gravel road past Thurmont, back in the trees, where the property line met the water's edge. It was a small place, 2 bedrooms, a main room with a stone fireplace, a kitchen that had not been updated since the 1980s and smelled permanently of cedar and lake water. Margaret had loved it here. She used to say the quiet was a different quality than city quiet, not the absence of sound, but the presence of something older. Nathan checked every room in under 4 minutes. Rachel sat at the kitchen table with her hands flat on the surface and her eyes on the door. I stood at the window that faced the water and looked at the surface of the lake, flat, pale gray under the October sky, completely still. They'll come in the afternoon, Nathan said, emerging from the back bedroom. Derek will want daylight for the transfer. He'll want to see the screen clearly confirm the routing, watch the numbers move. He set a small recording device on the kitchen shelf between two old paperback novels angled toward the main room. "I have legal authorization to record this conversation," he said, looking at me. "Every person present in this room is a party to what is said here. Everything said in this room today is evidence. And if they confess to each other before we come in," Rachel asked. "Then we have that too," Nathan said. We waited. An hour passed, then another. Rachel made coffee on the old stovetop percolator, and the three of us sat around the kitchen table and talked about things that had nothing to do with what was coming. A memory of a camping trip Nathan had taken here as a boy, the way the fireplace smoked, if you didn't open the flue all the way the summer. Margaret had tried to teach me to fish and given up after an afternoon of what she called my aggressive impatience with the process. We talked about her the way you talk about someone you love when you need them close and cannot have them carefully, with gratitude, letting the shape of her fill the room. Then we heard the car on the gravel. Nathan stood immediately. "Back bedroom," he said to me and Rachel. "Leave the door cracked. Don't come out until I do." We moved. Rachel took my arm as we went down the short hallway, and I felt the fine trembling in her grip. Not fear exactly, but the body's honest response to something enormous about to happen. We positioned ourselves in the back bedroom door, open by 3 inches, and we waited. The front door opened. Derek's voice came first, low, confident, already moving toward the main room, with the focused ease of a man who has arrived at the place he has been aiming for. "Signal's good," he said. "We can do this cleanly." Diane's voice. "Wait until I pull up the account." The sound of a laptop opening. Keyboard clicks. A pause. "That's not our account," Derek said. His voice had changed, the confidence still present, but sharpened now with an edge underneath it. "No," Diane said. "It's mine." The silence that followed was brief and electric. "Diane." Derek's voice had dropped to something very controlled and very cold. "What account is that?" "The one I opened in August," she said. "The one you don't know about." A sound, a chair scraping back. "You were going to take it all and leave me. You were going to hand me to a prosecutor and walk away clean." Her voice did not waver. "I found the recordings, Derek. All 14 hours of them. You've been building a case against me since the beginning. Those recordings exist to protect both of us. They exist to protect you." Her voice cracked on the last word, not with grief, but with fury, a hot, pressurized fury that had apparently been building for months. "You used me to get inside this family. You used me to get to Walter. And when it was over, you were going to let me take the fall while you walked out with clean hands and a sad story about being manipulated by a desperate woman. You came to me first." Derek's voice rose not loudly, but with the quality of something that has been held down too long and is now pushing through. "You sent the first message. You gave me Nathan's schedule. You prepared the power of attorney. Everything you did because you wanted out of your marriage and you wanted to take something with you on the way out. Don't stand here and tell me you're the victim. I'm not the victim." Diane's voice was shaking now, raw and stripped of its usual warmth, and hearing it like that practiced warmth simply gone sent something cold through my chest. "But I am also not going to prison while you testify against me and negotiate yourself a deal. You don't have a choice. Check it in. I have $42,000 in an account you can't touch, and a lawyer on retainer who specializes in exactly this kind of situation. How much of a choice do you think that is?" Nathan stepped out of the kitchen. I heard his footsteps cross the main room floor, unhurried, deliberate, the footsteps of a man with nowhere to rush to because he has already arrived. "That's enough," he said. The voices stopped. Rachel's hand tightened on my arm. I pushed the door open and we walked out together. Derek and Diane stood on opposite sides of the main room table, a laptop open between them, the screen still glowing with whatever transfer interface Diane had pulled up. They turned when they heard us, Derek first. Then Diane and I watched the sequence of expressions cross their faces in the space of perhaps 2 seconds. Surprise. Calculation. And then in Diane's case, something I had not expected, a flicker of something that might have been relief or might have been the exhaustion of a person who has been holding something very heavy for a very long time and has finally run out of the strength to keep holding it. Derek recovered first. He straightened, squaring his shoulders, reassembling the confident ease he wore like a second suit. "Nathan," he said, "let me explain." "I heard everything I need," Nathan said. He reached over and picked up the recording device from the shelf, holding it up briefly so they could both see it, then setting it in his jacket pocket. Every word. Derek's face went through 3 different expressions, in rapid succession: calculation, fury, and then a cold, final blankness that was somehow worse than either. Diane looked at me. I had not planned to speak. I had thought going into this day that what I wanted was simply to see it end, to see the mechanism that had been running against my family stopped cleanly and finally without drama. But I looked at this woman who had sat in my kitchen every Tuesday for 14 months, who had held my hand when I talked about missing Margaret, who had said, "You still have me," with a warmth so practiced it had felt like truth. And I found I had one thing left to say. "Diane," I said. My voice came out steady. "I want you to know something. I knew. 3 weeks before the cookout, I knew something was wrong. I moved the real documents. I replaced them with copies that would have sent any transfer into a closed routing system." I stepped closer to the table. "You were never going to get the money. Not a dollar of it. Not because Nathan stopped you, though he helped, but because I am a 72-year-old man who loved his wife for 41 years and learned everything he knows about paying attention from watching her." I looked at the laptop screen. "Whatever you had planned for that account, it was never going to work." Diane's mouth opened and closed. Her eyes went bright and wet, and for one moment, one single unguarded moment, I saw something in her face that was not performance and not calculation, but something genuine and deeply uncomfortable, the look of a person confronting the distance between who they intended to be and what they actually did. Then she looked away. Derek said nothing. He was looking at Nathan with the expression of a man doing rapid private arithmetic about what options remained to him and arriving at a number he did not like. Nathan took out his phone and made a call. On the drive home, the 3 of us were mostly quiet. The way people are after something enormous has concluded. Not empty, but full of something that needed time before it became words. The Maryland hills rolled past in the early evening light, the trees stripped of most of their color. Now the sky going that particular deep blue that comes just before dark in late October. Rachel said from the back seat, "Is it over?" I looked out the passenger window at the trees going past. "The part we could finish ourselves." I said yes. The consequences came the way consequences always come in real life. Not in a single dramatic moment, but in a series of smaller ones spread across days and weeks, each arriving with less theater than you might expect, and more weight than you were quite prepared for. Derek and Diane were arrested 11 days after the lake house. The federal charges included wire fraud, elder financial abuse under Maryland state law, and conspiracy. Nathan described the charge sheet to me over the phone in the careful, flattened tone of a man who has learned to keep his professional knowledge separate from his personal grief. He was not the agent who made the arrests. He had removed himself from any formal role in the investigation weeks earlier, the moment our family became directly involved. Someone else put the handcuffs on. I was glad. There was nothing I needed to witness in that moment that I had not already seen at the lake house. Rachel filed for divorce on a Tuesday. The same day of the week, Diane used to bring soup to my kitchen. I do not think that was a coincidence, and I did not say so to Rachel because some observations a father keeps to himself. The $180,000 from the Fieldcrest Drive sale remained exactly where I had always kept it untouched, in the account that Derek had accessed illegally and found he could do nothing useful with. My attorney Robert helped me move it to a new institution, entirely on a bright cold morning in early November, when the last of the leaves were coming down from the oak tree in my backyard. November the 9th was a Saturday. Nathan called at 8 in the morning. "Any chance you're cooking tonight?" "I was thinking of grilling," I said. A pause. "Dad, it's 40 degrees. 41. Do you want to come or not?" "I'll bring Rachel. Tell her to bring wine, the good kind. We've earned it." They arrived at 4 o'clock. Rachel came through the front door with 2 bottles and the expression of someone who was working on being all right and making genuine daily progress toward it. Nathan followed in a coat I had not seen before, something new, unconnected to the life he had been living 3 months ago. He looked tired in the deep structural way that has nothing to do with sleep and everything to do with the kind of season he had just survived. I had the grill going in the backyard. Same old grill Nathan had offered 3 times to replace. Same picnic table. Same folding chairs, though I had rearranged them slightly enough that the formation was different from the Sunday in September, when Derek had stood beside me with a glass of wine and a smile that went all the way to its edges. "It's absolutely freezing," Rachel said, sitting down and pulling her coat tight around her shoulders. "Your mother always said cold weather grilling builds character," I told her. "Mom said that about everything she didn't want to argue about." But she was smiling a real smile. Eyes included the kind I had not seen on her face in a long time. Nathan stood beside the grill with his hands in his pockets and looked at me in the way he has when he is assembling something carefully before he speaks. "Dad," he said, "I need to say something, and I want to get it right." "Take your time," I told him. "I missed it," he said. 19 years, and I keep going back and forth between thinking she was that good at hiding it and thinking I was that determined not to look." His voice was even, but I could hear the reckoning underneath it, not self-pity, which is not in Nathan's nature, but something more honest. "I don't know which one is true." "Probably both," I said. "In my experience, those 2 things tend to operate together." His mouth pulled at one corner. Not quite a smile, but the shape a smile makes when it is too tired to fully arrive. Rachel leaned forward in her chair. "You want to know what I think?" "You'll tell me regardless," Nathan said. "How you are the most observant person I know when you decide to look at something," she said. "But you loved her, and loving someone means choosing sometimes not to see." "That's not a flaw, Nathan. That's just what love costs." She paused. "You paid it. That's not something to be ashamed of." Nathan looked at his sister for a long moment. Something moved through his expression, the particular gratitude of a person who has been understood accurately and doesn't quite know what to do with it. "When did you get wise?" he said. "I have always been wise," Rachel said. "You just never thought to ask." He laughed. Sudden, brief, completely real, the laugh of a man surprised by his own capacity for it after everything. 4 seconds. It was one of the finest sounds I had heard all year. I turned the steaks and looked at my 2 children in the cold, late afternoon light, and I thought about everything that had happened since the last Sunday of September. The glass I almost drank. The drawer that had been opened. 14 months of Tuesday afternoons constructed carefully around my grief. I thought about Rachel's handwritten notes on a folded piece of paper, about Nathan putting his hand over mine at the kitchen table and saying things a father needs to hear. Dad, Rachel's voice had dropped into something past careful language. Are you lonely? Not tonight. In general, are you still? Yes, I said. Sometimes. That part hasn't changed. I looked at her steadily. But your mother used to say there's a difference between loneliness and solitude. Loneliness is when the people you love aren't present. Solitude is when you've made peace with yourself. She was working toward solitude. I set the tongs down. I'm working toward it too, and I'm closer than I was in September. Rachel stood and crossed the yard and put her arms around me from behind her chin on my shoulder, the way she used to when she was small and simply wanted to be near. We're going to do better, she said. About showing up, about calling, about asking you directly what you need instead of waiting for someone else to tell us. I know you are, I said, and I'm going to do better about asking instead of waiting. Nathan had moved closer. He stood beside the grill now within arm's reach, and when he spoke, his voice had the roughened quality it gets when he is saying something that costs him something to say. You protected this family, Dad. Not the money, though, yes, the money too. But that's not what I mean. He met my eyes and held them. You saw something was wrong before any of us did. You kept your reaction hidden for 4 weeks while she sat in your kitchen, and you never showed her a single crack. A pause. I do this for a living. I have done it for 20 years. What you did, the patience of it, I wouldn't have done it better. My throat tightened. I looked away for a moment at the oak tree, its branches stripped bare, now the same tree where Nathan had broken his collarbone at age 9, the same tree Margaret had asked me never to cut down. I had good reasons, I said, finally. You had us, Nathan said. We went inside and ate for 3 hours. We talked about things that mattered and things that didn't, and the things that didn't matter were sometimes the most necessary ones to say out loud. When they left, I stood on the porch and watched their taillights disappear. Then I went inside and sat in Margaret's chair, the one I had quietly taken over without meaning to, the one that still held the shape of someone I would spend the rest of my life missing. And I thought about what it means to be 72 years old and still capable of being surprised by the people you love. Not because everything turns out right, but because they show up, in the cold, without being asked. And sometimes that is enough. Sometimes that is everything. I have been sitting in Margaret's chair for a long time tonight, thinking about what this story really was. It was not a story about money. $180,000 was never the point. The point was that someone studied my grief, learned the shape of my loneliness, and used both against me, and I almost let her. Not because I was foolish, but because I was human, and humans need to be needed, and sometimes we do not check carefully enough who is doing the needing. If I could give you one piece of advice from everything I lived through, it would be this: do not wait for someone to tell you your family is too busy. Pick up the phone yourself. Ask the question directly. The answer you get from your own child will always be truer than the one delivered by someone standing between you. I also believe, and I say this as a man who has made his peace with God in his own quiet way, that when we are at our most vulnerable, we are not abandoned. We are given something: a scratch on a drawer, a folded piece of paper, a son who notices the wrong number. Grace does not always arrive as comfort. Sometimes it arrives as clarity. My personal belief after 72 years, Dad's revenge is not anger. It is patience. It is knowing more than you show. And it is raising children who will sit with you in a cold backyard in November and eat a steak that is slightly overdone because their father insisted on grilling in 41-degree weather. For everyone in the adults 50-plus community who has ever felt invisible in their own family, you are not invisible. You are simply waiting for the right moment to remind them. If this story moved you, I would love to know what you took from it. Leave a comment below. Tell me which moment stayed with you longest. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And if you haven't already considered joining this family by subscribing to Dad's Family Stories, because every week there is another story worth sitting with. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for staying with me until the very end. The stories that follow contain some fictional elements created purely for the purpose of reflection and life lessons. If this type of content is not for you, we completely respect that. Please feel free to step away and find what speaks to you. But if you're still here, I'm glad you are.